There are deeds recorded in the Loudoun County Courthouse that list the Hargrove Plantation as having been sold on the 14th of March, 1868. 112 acres of tobacco land along the western bank of Goose Creek, transferring hands from the estate of a dead man to a northern businessman who had never set foot in Virginia. The papers were signed, the money changed hands. The transaction was legal, witnessed and notarized. But when the new owner arrived that following April to survey what he had purchased, he found something no deed had mentioned. Something that made him write a letter to his lawyer in Philadelphia the very same night. A letter so careful in its phrasing, so measured in its alarm, that the lawyer who received it reportedly read it 3 times before he understood what his client was trying to say without quite saying it. The land had been sold. The house was empty. The fields were silent. And yet, behind the main house, in a cluster of 4 small cabins that the estate inventory had listed as no longer in use, a family was living, cooking, sleeping, raising children, maintaining fences, tending a garden, keeping a fire, as if the transaction had never occurred, as if the war had ended differently, as if someone had told them about the sale and they had looked at the deed, looked at the man who brought it, and decided that a piece of paper recorded in a courthouse 30 miles away did not constitute a sufficient reason to leave the only land any of them had ever known. What Thomas Fenwick found on that land in the spring of 1868 was not a ghost story. It was something far more difficult to explain and far more unsettling to confront, because it turned out that the family in those cabins was not there by accident, not there by confusion, and not there by any failure to understand their legal situation. They were there because they had decided to be there. And they had spent years, possibly decades, preparing for the moment when someone would come to tell them they had to leave. This is the story of the Hargrove Plantation, of the family that stayed, and of what happened when Thomas Fenwick tried to make them go. If you are new here, welcome. This channel exists for exactly this kind of story. History that was never put in the textbooks. Names that were never meant to be remembered. Subscribe right now so you never miss a story like this one. Hit the notification bell and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to Virginia, 1868, and find out exactly who was living on land that had already been sold, and why they were not afraid of the man who came to remove them. To understand what Thomas Fenwick found in April of 1868, you have to first understand what that land had been before he bought it, and what it had cost the people who had worked it. The Hargrove Plantation had been one of the older tobacco operations in Loudoun County, Virginia, settled in the 1790s by a man named Elias Hargrove, who had come south from Maryland with a small inheritance, a surveyor's instinct, and very little else. He was not from one of the great Virginia families. He carried no colonial legacy, no ancestral name that opened doors in Richmond drawing rooms. What he had was a particular kind of intelligence that expressed itself not in letters or philosophy, but in transactions. In the reading of land, of credit, of weather, of men. He could look at a field and know what it would yield. He could look at a man and know what he would cost. By 1810, Elias Hargrove had established a working plantation of 62 acres along the western bank of Goose Creek, growing tobacco for the Richmond market and supplementing his income with a small stand of hardwood timber along the creek's southern bend. He owned, according to the census of that year, 14 enslaved people, men, women, and children, and he ran his operation with the kind of meticulous economy that squeezed every possible yield from every possible resource, human and otherwise, without waste and without sentiment. He was not, by the accounts of his neighbors, a man given to cruelty for its own sake. That distinction mattered enormously to the men of Loudoun County, who drew careful and self-serving lines between degrees of behavior and spoke of those lines as though they constituted a moral code worthy of respect. What Elias Hargrove was, by those same accounts, was efficient. He purchased carefully and sold rarely. He kept detailed records of everything that moved through his hands: harvests, expenses, debts paid and owed, and the names, ages, approximate heights, and physical descriptions of every person he claimed as property. Those records survived him. They survived his son. They survived the war, and they are part of what makes this story possible to tell at all. Elias Hargrove died in 1831 of a lung complaint, leaving the plantation to his only surviving son, Nathaniel, who was then 23 years old and had been working alongside his father for the previous 4 years, learning the operation with the reluctant thoroughness of a young man who would have preferred to be elsewhere, but understood that there was no elsewhere for him to go. Nathaniel was a different kind of man from his father, larger in appetite, less precise in method, more interested in the social machinery of the county than in the rows of his fields. Where Elias had been content to manage 62 acres with obsessive care, Nathaniel wanted more. More land, more production, more standing among the families whose company he coveted and whose respect he pursued with an energy that sometimes outpaced his actual resources. By 1840, through a combination of purchases made at favorable moments in the tobacco market, a profitable marriage to the daughter of a neighboring landowner named Walter Pruitt, and the inheritance of a small adjacent parcel from a cousin who had died without heirs in 1838, Nathaniel had expanded the plantation to 112 acres and increased the number of enslaved workers to 30. 1. The expansion was real. The prosperity it suggested was somewhat less so. Nathaniel Hargrove was a man who spent at the edges of what he earned and sometimes slightly beyond them, and the debts that accumulated during his years of expansion would eventually prove to be the mechanism by which the story of this plantation took its particular shape. But in the late 1830s, debt was still a manageable abstraction, and the more immediate reality of the plantation was its daily operation. The fields, the cabins, the work schedule, the 100 small negotiations between labor and management that constituted plantation life. It was into this operational world that a man named Henry arrived in the late spring of 1836. The estate records list him plainly. Henry, age approximate 28, purchased from the estate of R. Dunmore, Fauquier County, April 1836, skilled in cooperage and field work. Price, $4.75. He arrived on the Hargrove plantation with a wife named Ada and a daughter who was then approximately 3 years old. The child's name, as recorded in Nathaniel Hargrove's household book, appears simply as Girl Child Approx 3 Healthy. They would come, in the years that followed, to know her as Clara. It is impossible, from the distance of more than a century and a half, to reconstruct the interior lives of Henry and Ada with anything approaching completeness. The historical record does not preserve the thoughts of people who were not permitted to write them down, or whose writings, if they existed, were not considered worth preserving. What survives is the outline, the shape pressed into official documents, estate accounts, letters written by other people about them. And within that shape, if you look carefully enough, something that begins to suggest intention. Henry was, by every indication available in the surviving record, an unusually capable man. The estate accounts note his cooperage skills from the beginning. The making and repair of wooden barrels was essential work on any tobacco plantation, since the hogshead barrels used to store and ship cured leaf had to be built to precise specifications and maintained in a condition that would not compromise the product. But within a few years of his arrival, the accounts begin to reference NRI in ways that suggest his role had expanded considerably beyond barrel making. By 1842, Nathaniel Hargrove's household ledger references Henry's count when tallying the yield from the North Field harvest, implying that Henry was performing the measurement and calculation rather than simply the labor. In 1844, an entry records repair to east fence line per Henry's assessment, meaning Henry had not only identified a structural problem, but had determined the appropriate response, and Hargrove had agreed with his conclusion and acted on it. By 1845, a notation reads without further explanation, spoke with Henry Ree, the creek drainage problem on the South Quarter. His suggestion to redirect the secondary channel to follow the old surveyor's line was followed. Water receded by midweek. The south quarter should now be workable by next spring. This was not the language Nathaniel Hargrove used to describe most of his workers. Most entries in his ledger referred to the people he owned in functional terms, by task, by output, by cost. Henry was being described as a collaborator, a man whose judgment Hargrove trusted enough to follow. This does not mean Henry's situation was comfortable or safe or anything approaching what it should have been. The language of the ledger does not record what Henry's daily life cost him, what it meant to offer counsel that was taken and yet receive no credit, no wage, no freedom in return. It records only the functional fact of his usefulness, but that usefulness, accumulated over years, had consequences. Consequences for the relationship between Henry's family and the Hargroves, and consequences for what Henry was allowed to know about the land he worked. Ada, for her part, occupied a different kind of centrality in the plantation's life. She was the property's primary healer and midwife, a role that in the antebellum South carried enormous practical importance and an unusual degree of mobility. Illness did not respect the boundaries between the cabins and the main house. Neither did childbirth. Ada moved between both. And in doing so, she moved between worlds, between the life of the back cabins and the life of the main house, between the community of the enslaved and the domestic sphere of the Hargroves, with a regularity and an intimacy that few other people on the plantation could claim. Nathaniel's wife, Caroline Hargrove, née Pruitt, wrote about Ada in a letter to her sister in Alexandria in 1843 with a warmth that contains, if you read it carefully, a certain uncomfortable dependency. Ada continues indispensable in all matters of the sick room, and possessed of a knowledge of herbs and simples that has saved more than one life on this farm and several in the county besides. I do not know what we should do without her, and I confess I am sometimes frightened by how much I have come to rely on her judgment in matters where my own is insufficient. I do not know what we should do without her. I have come to rely on her judgment. These were not words Caroline Hargrove would have written about a person she considered simply property. They were words about someone she had come to need. And need, in the social economy of the antebellum plantation, was a form of power, however unacknowledged and however constrained. Together, Henry and Ada occupied a position on the Hargrove plantation that was unusual in its structure, if not in its essential nature. They were not free. They were never free. The fact of their captivity was the foundation on which every other fact rested, and nothing in the warmth of Caroline's letter or the respectful language of Nathaniel's ledger changes that. But within the architecture of captivity, they had found a set of functions, Henry's management knowledge, Ada's medical knowledge, that gave them access to information and relationships that most of the people around them did not have. And their daughter Clara was growing up inside all of it. She was approximately 3 years old when her family arrived at Hargroves. She would have had no memory of any other place, any other land. This was the world she was born into conscious understanding. The fields along Goose Creek, the 4 back cabins, the main house with its tall windows, the creek itself winding south through the timber stand. She grew up watching her father discuss drainage problems with the man who owned him, and watching her mother move between the cabins and the sick room with herbs and knowledge that kept people alive. She grew up learning. Everything she saw, everything she heard, the names of things, the value of things, the way the land worked and the way the people who claimed to own it worked, the particular blindnesses of men who had convinced themselves that the people serving them were not fully observing what was happening around them. Clara was observing everything. The first trace of something unusual in the Hargrove records appears in the late autumn of 1851. Nathaniel Hargrove's household accounts, which had been kept in a small leather-bound ledger with the consistency that reflected his father's training, if not quite his father's precision, show a gap between November of 1851 and February of 1852. 3 months during which no entries were made at all, no purchases recorded, no wages noted, no maintenance costs tallied, No harvest figures calculated. For a man who had recorded the price of a new axe handle in 1837, and the cost of a length of rope in 1844, and the feed consumption of 3 horses over the winter of 1848, this silence was, in the language of the ledger, a scream. The accounts resume in February of 1852 without explanation or reference to the preceding gap. The first entry, dated the 4th of that month, records the purchase of lumber, 6 planks, white oak from Holt's Mill for construction of new partition in the south cabin. One of the 4 back cabins had been divided into 2 separate spaces. This detail might mean nothing in isolation. Wood is purchased. Spaces are reconfigured. People build walls for practical reasons, for warmth, for privacy, for storage. But when set alongside another document, a letter written by Nathaniel's wife Caroline to her sister Margaret in Alexandria, dated January 14, 1852, and preserved by chance in a cardboard box of mixed family correspondence that found its way to the Virginia Historical Society collection in 1921. The lumber purchase begins to mean something quite different. The letter, which occupies 2 pages and is primarily concerned with a discussion of Caroline's eldest son, Edward's progress in his Latin studies and an account of a neighborhood social gathering held at the Pruitt farm the previous month, contains a single paragraph near the end that breaks from the domestic tone of everything before it with an abruptness that must have startled its recipient. The paragraph appears without introduction or explanation, as if Caroline had been building toward it through the pleasantries and had finally arrived at the thing she had sat down to write. I will not say more of what occurred here in December, as Nathaniel has made it plain that the matter is closed, and I am to make no further mention of it in correspondence or in conversation with anyone. I will only say that things have been managed in the way that Nathaniel believes best, and that Ada is well, which is more than I expected when I first fully understood the situation. The child has been settled in the south room, which has been made more private for the purpose, and I trust the arrangement will hold as it must for all our sakes. I will write again when I have something more pleasant to tell you. Give my love to Father. The matter is closed. Ada is well. The child has been settled in the south room. What child? Caroline's letter gives no name, no age, no context for how this child arrived or whose child it was. And yet the phrasing of that paragraph, its careful vagueness, its conspicuous omissions, its air of having said everything while technically saying very little, has the particular quality of a communication, written by a woman who knows her correspondent will understand exactly what she is not saying. The word settled, chosen with the deliberateness that characterized the correspondence of educated women of that era, who used language as a precision instrument, suggests not comfort, but management. Not a child who had been placed somewhere safe and warm, but a child who had been placed somewhere controlled, somewhere that a wall had been built to create, made more private for the purpose. The question of whose child this was, and what had occurred in December of 1851, is one that the surviving documents decline to answer in plain language. They were living in a world where certain things were understood by everyone involved and recorded by no one, because recording them would have transformed a private arrangement into a public fact, and public facts have consequences that private arrangements can sometimes avoid. But the records do not refuse to answer entirely. They leave traces, the kind of traces that accumulate over time until they form a shape that is impossible to misread, even if no single document states the thing directly. In the spring of 1852, a notation appears in the Hargrove estate accounts that had not appeared in any previous year. A quarterly allotment of cloth, shoes, candles, and foodstuffs, recorded as distinct from the general provisions distributed to the rest of the workers, is listed as allocated to the South Room per N.H.'s standing instruction. The allotment is modest in quantity but specific in its separation from the general household accounting. It is provisioned directly by Nathaniel Hargrove's personal order, not through the general account managed by his wife. This allotment continues quarterly through 1852, 1853, and into 1854. At which point the notation in the ledger changes slightly, almost imperceptibly. It now reads, allotment, south cabin, 2 persons. A second person had arrived in the south cabin, or been born into it. By 1856, the notation reads, south cabin, 3 persons. By 1858, south cabin, 3 persons. Additional cloth allotment per NH for the child's winter clothing. Whatever had been settled in that divided cabin in the winter of 1851 had grown. It had become, over the course of less than a decade, its own small and entirely separate household within the larger household of the plantation, provisioned directly, maintained quietly, and apparently never discussed in any document that named what it was or explained why it existed. Clara was, by 1858, approximately 25 years old. Her parents, Henry and Ada, were in their late 40s and early 50s, aging but still capable. The south cabin, once listed in the estate inventory as occupied by a single field worker named Ned who had died in 1849, now housed what the ledger counted as 3 persons. What the ledger did not record was who those 3 persons were, what their names were, or what their connection was to the Hargrove family. The ledger was, in that regard, an instrument of its time and its purpose. It recorded what mattered economically, and omitted what was merely human. There is one more document worth examining before the story moves toward the war. It is not from the Hargrove papers at all. It is from the records of the Loudoun County Circuit Court in a folder of minor civil matters from the autumn of 1858. The folder contains a petition submitted by a neighboring farmer named Cyrus Van, who claimed that Nathaniel Hargrove owed him a debt of $40 from a land measurement dispute in 1856 and sought to recover it through the court. The petition was ultimately denied on a procedural technicality. What makes the file relevant is not the petition itself, but an affidavit submitted by a witness named James Prout, a farm laborer who had worked briefly for Van and claimed to have observed the land transaction in question. The affidavit runs to 2 pages and is primarily concerned with the specifics of a property line that neither Van nor Hargrove had formally surveyed. But near the end of the second page, in a passage entirely unrelated to the debt claim and apparently offered by Prout as a kind of general character statement about the Hargrove property, there appears a sentence that the court recorded faithfully and then apparently found no reason to examine further. I will say that the situation at Hargrove's place was widely known in the county, if not widely spoken of, particularly as regarded the girl kept in the back house and whose she was understood to be. And I believe any man of the county could tell you the same if he chose to, though none would say it in writing or before a judge. The girl in the back house, who she was understood to be. James Prout did not say more. He was not asked to say more. The court was interested in $40 and a property line, not in the private arrangements of a tobacco farmer's household. The affidavit was filed. The petition was denied. Cyrus Van did not recover his $40, and in the back cabins of the Hargrove plantation, a family continued to live and to know and to remember. By the time the war began in 1861, there were, in those 4 cabins behind the main house, 3 generations of a family that had been on that land for 25 years. Henry and Ada, now approaching 60. Clara, their daughter, in her late 20s. And in the south cabin, which Nathaniel Hargrove's personal ledger provisioned quarterly under a standing instruction that no one had ever formally explained, 2 children who had been born on that land and whose connection to the Hargrove family was understood by every man in Loudoun County and recorded by none of them. This is the foundation. These are the people. Now the war comes, and everything that the war was supposed to change, and the remarkable amount that it left exactly as it had been. The Civil War arrived in Loudoun County not as a single cataclysm, but as a slow deterioration. A gradual unraveling of the structures that had organized the county's economic and social life for decades, interrupted by moments of sudden and concentrated disruption that left marks on the landscape and on the people that neither recovered from entirely. Loudoun County was, from the very beginning of the conflict, contested terrain. Its geographic position in the northern tip of Virginia, tucked between the Potomac River to the north and the Blue Ridge Mountains to the west, made it a corridor, a zone of movement and conflict through which both armies passed repeatedly and which neither could fully control for extended periods. Union forces swept through the county in the summer of 1861, establishing themselves along the Potomac crossings. Confederate cavalry used the county's roads and farms as supply and communication lines through 1862 and into 1863. By 1864, after 3 years of armies moving back and forth across the same ground, much of the county had been stripped of its livestock, its stored grain, significant portions of its timber, and a substantial part of its working population, both enslaved and free, who had fled, been carried off, or died in the confusion of repeated military passages. The Hargrove Plantation was not spared from any of this. Nathaniel Hargrove, who was 56 years old when the war began and had been managing a recurring heart complaint for the previous 2 years, did not serve in the Confederate military. His eldest son, Edward, the same Edward whose Latin studies Caroline had written about in 1852, enlisted with a Virginia cavalry regiment in the spring of 1861. Full of the particular confidence of young men in the early weeks of a war that everyone assumed would be brief. He was killed at the Battle of Second Manassas in August of 1862 at 25 years of age. The fact of his death is recorded in a single line in the household account book, written in a hand that appears slightly different from the surrounding entries, slower, heavier, as if the pen had been harder to lift. His second son, Charles, who was 22 in 1861 and had been working the plantation alongside his father while Edward served, was conscripted into Confederate service in 1863. He returned from the war in the spring of 1865, having survived 2 years of a conflict that consumed men at a rate that made survival itself a kind of accident. He returned with a damaged arm. The nature of the injury is not specified in any surviving document, and with a quality of silence about the preceding years that those who knew him described in later correspondence as something more than ordinary reticence. He had been present at things he did not speak of. He had seen the architecture of the world he had grown up in collapse, piece by piece, and he had come home to what remained of it. What remained of it was less than he had left. The tobacco fields, underworked and in some areas physically damaged by the passage of armies and the digging of temporary earthworks, produced a fraction of their pre-war yields. The timber stands along the southern bend of the creek had been largely cleared in 1862 by Union engineers looking for bridge-building material, an act of military necessity that had the practical effect of eliminating one of the plantation's secondary income sources entirely. The livestock was gone. The fencing along the northern boundary, which had always required maintenance, had deteriorated in the years when there was no one with the time or the resources to maintain it. And the labor force, the 31 people who had been listed in Nathaniel Hargrove's 1860 inventory, had diminished dramatically. Through the war years, as Confederate authority in the county fluctuated and Union forces moved closer, people had run. People had been taken. People had made the calculations that people make when the structures of their captivity begin to crack, and they had moved through those cracks toward the Union lines, toward the contraband camps, toward whatever they could reach that was not the place they had been held. By the war's end in 1865, of the 31 people listed in the 1860 inventory, the Freedmen's Bureau agents who canvassed Loudoun County in the late summer and autumn of that year would find most of them registered at various locations across the county and in neighboring areas, people claiming names, claiming wages, claiming the new legal reality of their freedom with the urgency of those who had waited their entire lives for the moment to arrive. The family in the back cabins of the Hargrove Plantation was not among them. Henry and Ada were not on the Freedmen's Bureau registration lists. Clara was not on those lists. The children in the South cabin, who would have been teenagers by 1865, were not on those lists. None of them registered. None of them presented themselves to the Bureau's agents. None of them filed labor contract claims or wage complaints or any of the other formal documents that the Bureau was established to facilitate. In a county where the Bureau's records show hundreds of formerly enslaved people formally registering their new legal status, this complete absence is not a small thing. It is not an oversight or an administrative gap. It is a choice. And like all choices made by people whose choices were never meant to be significant, it requires examination. Bureau Agent Alton Davies conducted a survey of labor arrangements in the western portion of Loudoun County in the autumn of 1865. His survey report, which is preserved in the Bureau's records at the National Archives in the collection of Virginia field reports for that year, contains a brief entry on the Hargrove Plantation that is worth reading carefully. At the Hargrove Farm, Western Goose Creek, found the proprietor N. Hargrove confined to his room with a complaint of the heart and unable to conduct business. The house is managed by his son C. Hargrove, who was not available to meet. 4 cabins at the rear of the main house are occupied by a colored family, a man and woman of advanced age, their adult daughter, and 3 children. When inquired whether they intended to register and whether a labor contract for the coming season had been arranged or contemplated, the elder man said only that arrangements had been made and that they were well and had what they needed. He declined to say more on the subject. The younger woman, the daughter, stated that they had no need of the Bureau's assistance at this time and that they understood their situation fully. She was polite but entirely firm. I was not invited inside any of the cabins. I noted that the south cabin appeared to have been recently repaired, new chinking on the north wall and a replaced threshold board, and that a small kitchen garden behind it was well maintained despite the lateness of the season. A cord of firewood, freshly split, was stacked against the east wall. I did not press the matter further and proceeded to the next property on my survey. Read that entry again slowly, because it contains more than it appears to. Arrangements had been made. Henry said this, a man in his late 50s, a man who had been on this land for nearly 30 years, a man who had built drainage systems and managed harvests and offered counsel that the owner of the plantation had followed, and he said it with a specificity that is not the language of vagueness. He did not say we have nowhere to go or we are still working out what to do. He said arrangements had been made, past tense, completed arrangements, already in place. She stated that they had no need of the Bureau's assistance and that they understood their situation fully. Clara, 22 years after she arrived on this land as a 3-year-old child, 22 years of watching, of learning, of understanding, telling the Bureau's agent with complete politeness and absolute firmness that she understood her situation. Not that she was confused about it, not that she was waiting to understand it, but that she already did, fully, and that the Bureau's assistance was therefore not required. Alton Davies moved on to the next farm. He did not return to the Hargrove property. His note has the slightly puzzled, slightly uneasy quality of a man who had expected to find distress and found instead a settled, purposeful quiet, who had come to help and been gently, firmly, completely declined. What had been arranged? Nathaniel Hargrove died in January of 1866, 4 months after Davies's visit. He died in the room he had been confined to when the Bureau agent came, with whatever arrangements he had made, with Clara, with Henry and Ada, or with all of them, already in place and apparently already understood by everyone who needed to understand them. He left behind a house, 112 acres of damaged land, a set of debts accumulated during the war years, and a son who was not equipped, emotionally, financially, or temperamentally, to manage any of it. Charles Hargrove attempted to take control of the estate in the weeks after his father's death. He rode to Leesburg and spoke with the attorney named Colton, who managed the family's legal affairs. He returned to the plantation with a set of numbers that confirmed what he had probably already suspected. The land was worth something, but the debts against it were substantial, and the prospect of making the farm profitable again without capital, without equipment, and without a reliable labor force was somewhere between very difficult and impossible. He spent one season trying. The spring of 1866, with money borrowed against the estate and 2 hired hands he found through the Freedmen's Bureau, men who came, worked for a few weeks, and left when the payment schedule proved unreliable, Charles Hargrove attempted to plant tobacco in the North Field, the field his father's ledger had described as the property's most reliable producer. The attempt was unsuccessful. The field was under-prepped, the seed was planted late, and the summer brought a stretch of dry weather that reduced the yield to a quantity not worth the cost of harvesting. By late 1866, Charles Hargrove was done. He packed what personal belongings he cared about, settled what small accounts he could, and left the plantation without completing a sale or a formal arrangement of any kind. He went apparently to Richmond. At least one letter addressed to him there exists from Colton the attorney regarding the outstanding debts, and after that, the historical record loses him. He does not appear in the 1870 census for Loudoun County or for Richmond. He may have gone further west. He may have gone north. He does not appear to have looked back. He left behind the house, the outbuildings, the fields, the fencing along Goose Creek, the south storage barn with its damaged roof, the well house, the 4 back cabins, and the family that had been living in those cabins for 30 years. For approximately 2 years, from Charles's departure in late 1866 to the sale of the estate in March of 1868, the Hargrove plantation existed in a legal limbo. The debts were managed at a distance by Colton, who was attempting to find a buyer willing to take the property at a price sufficient to cover what was owed. The land sat in that particular southern condition of the immediate post-war years, nominally owned, practically abandoned, officially for sale, and actually, behind the main house, in 4 small cabins, occupied by a family who used those 2 years in ways that a later examination of the property would find both mysterious and, to certain observers, deeply unsettling. Thomas Fenwick was 41 years old in the spring of 1868, and he was, in the way of men who have made money during times of upheaval, somewhat too confident in what money could accomplish. He was a Philadelphia hardware merchant, nails, hinges, structural fittings, the unglamorous ironmongery of construction, who had spent the war years supplying Union quartermasters with the material components of a military machine that consumed them by the ton. It had been, from a purely business perspective, an excellent war for Thomas Fenwick. He had entered the conflict with a medium-sized business, a modest credit line, and a reputation in Philadelphia hardware circles as a reliable if uninspired supplier. He emerged from it with a substantially larger business, a much more comfortable credit position, and a reputation that had expanded to include certain government contacts who found him useful. He was not a cruel man. It is important to establish this, because the story that follows might tempt a reader to cast him as a villain, and that casting would be both too simple and somewhat beside the point. Thomas Fenwick was a practical man, a man of ledgers and assessments and the particular form of confidence that comes from having been right about enough transactions that you begin to assume your assessments are reliable by default. He had no particular feeling about Virginia or about the South. He had no romantic attachment to the landscape, no politics about what the war had meant beyond its economic consequences, no strong views about the people who had lived and worked and suffered on that land. What he had was a calculation. 112 acres of Virginia tobacco land, currently encumbered by manageable debts and available at a price of $800, could, if properly worked, produce a return on investment within 4 to 6 years. He had done the arithmetic. The arithmetic was favorable. He bought the land by mail in March of 1868, communicating through Colton the attorney with letters that were models of business precision and almost entirely free of curiosity about the land's history or its current condition beyond what the assessment report had covered. He paid $800, received a deed recorded in the Loudoun County Courthouse, and arranged to travel to Virginia in April to survey his new property and begin making plans for its restoration. He arrived on the 14th of April, 1868, exactly 1 month after the deed was recorded, on an April morning that was, by the account of his later letter, cold and clear and smelling of turned earth and creek water. He had hired a wagon and a driver in Leesburg and made the journey to the western part of the county along roads that were still showing, 3 years after the war, the marks of armies that had passed over them too many times for the damage to be easily repaired. The house was visible from the road, a substantial 2-story frame structure with a covered front porch, white paint that had gone grey and peeling over the war years, green shutters that had begun to warp from their hinges. It had been once a respectable house. It was still in its bones a respectable house. Fenwick's assessment report had called it structurally sound but in need of cosmetic repair. And looking at it from the road, Fenwick confirmed this evaluation and moved his attention to the fields. The fields were, as the assessment had described, underproductive but not ruined. The north field showed signs of having been partially worked the previous season. Fenwick didn't know about Charles's failed 1866 attempt, but the furrow lines had mostly been reclaimed by weeds and volunteer growth. The south field, closer to the creek, was in better condition, the soil dark and obviously well drained. He spent perhaps 20 minutes walking the front of the property, making notes in a small leather notebook, before he walked around the main house to examine the rear outbuildings. The south storage barn had a damaged roof on its eastern side, as the assessment had noted. The well house was intact, and the water which Fenwick tested was cold and clean. The chicken coop, listed in the 1860 inventory as housing 20 birds, was empty, and then, past the well house, past the chicken coop, along the worn path that ran parallel to the rear wall of the main house, there were the 4 cabins. The estate inventory that Colton's agent had compiled in the summer of 1867 had listed them as 4 outbuildings, formerly used as worker quarters, currently unoccupied. Generally sound condition. They were not unoccupied. From the chimney of the 3rd cabin, the one that faced east, the one that in the estate records from the 1840s had been assigned to a cooper and his family, a thin line of smoke was rising into the April morning. Thomas Fenwick stopped walking. He stood approximately 50 yards from the cabins in the muddy area between the main house and the outbuildings, and he looked at that smoke for a long moment. Then he looked at the other cabins. The second one, which had a new threshold board on its door, the same repair that Davies had noted in 1865. The fourth one, closest to the tree line, which had firewood stacked neatly against its east wall, a quantity that suggested not one winter's supply, but careful long-term management of resources. And the first cabin, the largest one, the one that fronted the others, had laundry on a line strung between its corner post and a nearby tree. Small items, children's clothing, already dry in the April morning air. Thomas Fenwick was looking at a working household, not the remnant of one, not the detritus of a family that had been passing through. A functioning, maintained, currently inhabited home. He stood there for a moment longer. Then a door opened. The woman who came out of the 3rd cabin, the one with the smoking chimney, was, he estimated, somewhere in her mid-30s. She was wearing a dark dress, practical rather than formal, and she was carrying a wooden bucket that she had clearly been intending to take to the well. She saw him at the same moment he registered her fully, and she stopped, set down the bucket, and looked at him with an expression that he would later describe in his letter as not surprise and not fear and not hostility, something more like the expression of a person who has known something was coming and has been waiting to receive it. They looked at each other across 50 yards of mud and April air. Then the woman bent, picked up her bucket again, and walked, not toward the well, not away from him, directly toward Thomas Fenwick. Her name was Clara, and she had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. She stopped at a distance of perhaps 10 feet. She was, Fenwick noted in his letter, a woman of considerable composure, and he used that word with some apparent awareness of what it meant to observe composure in the circumstances, as if he recognized that the quality he was describing was itself a piece of information. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was even, not deferential, not aggressive. The tone of a person conducting a transaction. Fenwick, who was a man accustomed to conducting transactions, recognized the tone and responded to it in kind. "Good morning. I am Thomas Fenwick of Philadelphia. I have recently purchased this property. May I ask who you are and by what arrangement you are living here?" "My name is Clara," she said. "My family has been on this land since 1836. My father, Henry, and my mother, Ada, are in that cabin." She indicated the second cabin. "And my children are in the one behind me." "I see," said Fenwick. He looked at the cabins again, the laundry on the line, the firewood, the smoke. "And by what arrangement?" he repeated. "By a conversation with Mr. Nathaniel Hargrove," Clara said, "in the autumn of 1865 before he died." Fenwick was quiet for a moment. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind," Clara said, "that would be useful for you to understand before you decide anything." He was a man of business. He understood that this was not a threat, or not only a threat, but an offer of information. He said, "I'm listening." What Clara told him that morning, standing in the mud between the main house and the cabins, was not everything. She was too careful for everything. But it was enough to make Thomas Fenwick go directly to the main house, sit down at the old writing desk in the front room, the same desk where Nathaniel Hargrove had kept his ledgers, some of which were still on the shelf above it, and begin composing the letter to his lawyer in Philadelphia that would pass between 3 generations of the Fenwick family before anyone fully understood its meaning. Hungry, what did she tell him? She told him first about the land itself, with a specificity and an accuracy that stopped him almost immediately, and that he had no way of verifying on the spot, but that would prove, when he subsequently had the property resurveyed, to be entirely correct. The drainage system along the South Quarters Creek boundary, which Henry had designed in 1845, and which made the South Field the most productive on the property. The underground spring that fed the well house, and the second, smaller spring on the eastern boundary that had never been developed, but that she described in terms of its location and flow rate with the precision of someone who had known it for decades. The exact dimensions of the south storage barn, including the damage to the eastern roof section, and the precise cause of that damage, a falling tree limb in the ice storm of 1859, which had been only partially repaired at the time and had continued to deteriorate since. The state of the fencing along the northern boundary, the condition of the soil in each field, described in terms of what it would need to be brought back to full production. This knowledge, granular, precise, earned over 30 years of working the land, was the first thing Clara offered Thomas Fenwick. She offered it not as charity but as a demonstration. She was showing him what she knew. She was showing him that her family's understanding of this land went considerably deeper than anything in the assessment report he had relied on to make his purchase. Then she told him the second thing. The second thing was about the debts. Colton, the attorney, had managed the sale of the Hargrove estate as a straightforward transaction. The property, with its encumbrances, transferred to a buyer willing to assume those encumbrances in exchange for the title. The debts were real and documented. A banknote from 1861, borrowed against the harvest that never came. A supplier's debt from 1863. A smaller sum owed to a Leesburg merchant for goods purchased by Charles in 1866. But there was another debt, Clara told Fenwick, that had not appeared in Colton's accounting. A debt that Nathaniel Hargrove had acknowledged in the autumn of 1865, in the conversation she had mentioned, and that he had documented, in his own hand, witnessed by 2 neighbors who were still living and could be contacted, in a letter that Clara had kept in the south cabin for 3 years. Fenwick's expression, in the letter he wrote that night, is described by him as difficult to characterize. He asked to see the letter. Clara said she would show it to him in due time. Not yet. First, she wanted to finish telling him what he needed to know. The third thing she told him was about the children in the south cabin. Their names. She gave him their names, which the estate records had never given. The names she had chosen for them, rather than the names Nathaniel Hargrove had assigned to them in his quarterly allotment notes. She told him their ages. She told him, without elaborating beyond what was necessary, the nature of their parentage, which, as James Prout had told the Loudoun County Circuit Court in 1858, was something that any man in the county knew and none had written down. She told him the name of the man who was their father. She did not tell him this as an accusation. She had no interest in accusation. What she had, and what she was communicating with the precision of someone who has planned this conversation for years and has had nothing to do but refine it, was information, facts. The particular set of facts that connected the children in the south cabin to the Hargrove family, and that made the question of what rights those children had with respect to the land rather more complicated than a deed recorded in the county courthouse suggested. Thomas Fenwick sat with all of this for a very long time. The April morning had become April midday. From the cabins behind Clara, sounds had emerged. A child's voice, a door, the distant sound of Henry moving firewood. The ordinary sounds of a family living its life, the sounds of people who had been here for 30 years and intended to continue being here, unless someone could give them a sufficiently compelling reason to leave. Fenwick finally asked, "What is it that you want, Miss Clara?" She had been waiting for that question too. She answered it without hesitation. "We want to stay," she said. "We have been here longer than the deed your lawyer holds. We know this land better than any man you might hire to work it. My father built the drainage on the south quarter. My mother kept the Hargrove family alive through 3 children's illnesses and 2 fever seasons. I have maintained this property for 2 years, since Charles Hargrove left, which is why your assessment agent reported it as being in reasonable condition rather than in ruin, which it would have been otherwise." She looked at him steadily. "You paid $800 for land that is worth considerably more than $800, in part because we have been here. We are asking in return to remain in the cabins we have always occupied, on the terms that we will continue to maintain the property as we have done, and that my children will be formally recognized in writing as having the right to remain on this land for as long as they choose." Fenwick said, "You understand that the law—" "I understand the law," Clara said. "I would like you to understand it as well before you decide what to do." He asked to see the letter that night. Clara brought it to the main house after the evening meal. He had not been invited to share the meal, which was its own kind of statement, and he had managed with what he had brought from Leesburg, and she placed it on the desk in front of him without releasing it, her hand resting on the folded paper while she watched him. It was a single sheet of paper folded twice, written in a hand that Thomas Fenwick would later confirm, by comparison with the household ledgers still on the shelf above the desk, was unquestionably Nathaniel Hargrove's own. The letter was dated October 12, 1865. It was addressed to no one in particular, but began with the kind of formal preamble that suggested the writer had understood, or had been counseled, that the document needed to be able to stand on its own in a legal proceeding. "I, Nathaniel Hargrove, being of sound mind if not of sound body, do here set down what I intend to be a permanent and binding record of certain matters relating to the persons in my care and to the property I have owned and managed for the past 40 years. I set this down of my own will, without coercion or inducement, in the presence of witnesses whose names appear below, because I am not certain I will live to make these matters right through the proper legal channels, and I wish them to be as right as I can make them with the time remaining to me." The letter went on for 3 pages. Thomas Fenwick read all of it. It acknowledged, in terms that were careful but not ambiguous, that 2 of the children living in the south cabin of the Hargrove plantation had been fathered by Nathaniel Hargrove himself, the same December circumstance that Caroline had referenced in her letter of January 1852 without naming it directly. It acknowledged that those children had therefore a blood connection to the Hargrove family that, in a different legal context, might have carried very different implications. It acknowledged that Henry and Ada and Clara had served the plantation with a capability and dedication that the estate's records documented, and that this service had not been compensated or recognized as it should have been. And it stated, in the clearest language in the document, that it was Nathaniel Hargrove's wish and intention that Clara and her children, and Henry and Ada, for as long as they lived, should have the right to remain on the Hargrove land for as long as they chose to do so, and that any subsequent sale of the property should be understood to carry this obligation with it. Below Nathaniel Hargrove's signature were two others. The first belonged to a man named Walter Pruitt, Jr., the son of Nathaniel's father-in-law, a respected family in the county. The second belonged to Reverend James Halcott of the Goose Creek Meeting, a Quaker congregation whose members had a particular record in Loudoun County of witnessing documents on behalf of people who had limited access to formal legal instruments. Thomas Fenwick read the letter twice. Then he set it down carefully on the desk and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Clara sat across from him, her hands folded, waiting. "This is not a deed," Fenwick said finally. "This is not a legal instrument of the kind that would bind a property sale." "No," Clara agreed, "it is not. It would not hold up in a court of law as a title document." "No," she said again, "it would not." He looked at her. "Then why are you showing it to me?" "Because," Clara said, "a court of law is not the only place where things are decided." She let that sit for a moment before she continued. "The witnesses are still alive. Walter Pruitt, Jr. is well known in this county. Reverend Halcott is well known in this county, and beyond it. The nature of my children's parentage is, as I suspect you may have already heard from someone in Leesburg, not a secret in Loudoun County. If you take us to court to remove us from this land, which you have the legal right to do, all of these things will become part of the public record." Fenwick was very still. "I am not threatening you," Clara said. "I am explaining to you what is true. I want you to make a decision with complete information. It is more than anyone ever offered us." There it was, that last sentence. Quiet, not angry, not performed, just accurate. It is more than anyone ever offered us. The whole of it, in 11 words, the whole 30 years of it. Fenwick sat with all of this for what felt, to Clara, like a very long time, but was probably no more than 5 minutes. The fire in the front room's grate had burned down to coals. Outside, the April night was cold and entirely silent. Finally, he said, "You said you have maintained this property for 2 years. "Yes. The south field, the drainage system your father built. Is it still functional?" "The main channel is fully functional," Clara said. "The secondary eastern channel needs a small repair at the inlet. My father knows where and can show you." He nodded slowly. He was calculating. She could see it. The same ledger expression she had watched Nathaniel Hargrove deploy 100 times at this same desk over the years she had spent close enough to observe it. The calculation of costs and benefits, of what something was worth and what it would cost to get it. "The south field," he said. "If the secondary channel is repaired, what would it yield worked properly?" Clara told him. She told him with the precision of someone who had been keeping records in her head for years, in the absence of paper records she would not have been permitted to keep. She told him the average yield of the south field in good seasons before the war, the estimated impact of the drainage repair, the soil condition as she currently assessed it, and what she believed a working partnership between a capitalized owner and an experienced on-site management team could produce within 3 years. She used the phrase working partnership deliberately. She watched him hear it. He said, "And what would this working partnership look like, in practical terms?" She had prepared for this question for 2 years. She told him. What Clara proposed to Thomas Fenwick on the night of April 14, 1868, was not, by any standard of the time, what a newly freed black woman was expected to propose to a white northern businessman who had just purchased the land she was living on. It was not a plea, it was not a request for charity. It was not even primarily an appeal to guilt or to the obligations articulated in Nathaniel Hargrove's letter. though she had been precise about those and made clear that they formed part of the landscape of the negotiation. It was a business proposition. Clara proposed that her family would remain on the property as its primary caretakers and working managers, not as hired laborers paid a wage, but as tenant partners with a defined share of the annual yield from the south and north fields. She proposed that her father Henry, whose knowledge of the property's physical infrastructure was unmatched, would oversee the repair and maintenance of the drainage systems, fencing, and outbuildings, in exchange for a formal acknowledgement that his family's continued residence on the property was a condition of the tenancy arrangement rather than a matter of the owner's discretion. She proposed that the children in the south cabin, whose connection to the Hargrove family gave their situation a particular legal complexity that neither she nor Fenwick fully articulated that night, but that both of them understood, would be formally listed in any tenancy agreement as residents with guaranteed right of occupancy, independent of their mother's status. And she proposed that the agreement would be written down, signed, witnessed, recorded. Not because she trusted Thomas Fenwick, she had only known him for one day, and the lessons of her life were not of a kind that encouraged automatic trust of men who arrived holding deeds, but because a written, signed, witnessed, recorded agreement was harder to overturn than an understanding. She knew this because she had spent 30 years watching understandings get overturned, and she had watched the things that were harder to overturn. Fenwick listened to all of this. He asked questions, detailed, practical questions about the mechanics of the farming arrangement, about the yield-sharing percentages she was proposing, about who would manage the hiring of additional seasonal labor if the fields required it. He was treating the conversation increasingly as the business negotiation it was. She had calculated that he would. She had calculated that the way to reach Thomas Fenwick was not through sentiment or moral argument, but through the recognition that what she was offering him was genuinely valuable. The expertise, the institutional knowledge, the on-site management capacity that no hired overseer he could find at this price would bring to a damaged and complex property. She had calculated correctly. They talked until nearly midnight. Fenwick took notes in his small leather notebook. Clara spoke from memory, from the 30 years of careful accumulation that lived inside her without a page to rest on. At the end of it, Fenwick said, "I will need to think about this. I will need to speak with my lawyer." "Yes," Clara said. "You understand that I make no commitment tonight." "Yes," she said. "I understand that. And if I decide that the legal title I hold is sufficient and that I have no obligation, then I will understand what I need to do next," Clara said, "and so will you." He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them elaborated on what that meant. It was not necessary. They both understood what it meant. Fenwick said goodnight and went up to the main house's front bedroom, the one that had been Nathaniel Hargrove's. Clara went back to her cabin, where her children were asleep and where the fire had been banked against the April cold. She did not sleep well that night. She had done everything she could do. The rest of it was now in the hands of a man she had met that morning, who held a piece of paper with a courthouse stamp on it, and whose decision in the coming days would determine whether 30 years of careful preparation had been sufficient. She lay in the dark and listened to the creak and thought about her father, asleep in the next cabin, and about her mother, whose health had been declining for the past year, and about her children in the south cabin, who did not fully know yet how close the edge of everything was, and whom she had been determined, for as long as she had been old enough to be determined about anything, to keep on the right side of it. Thomas Fenwick was in Leesburg for 4 days. He stayed at the county's principal inn, ate at a table near the window where he could watch the street, and spent his time in a series of conversations that he had not anticipated needing to have, but that the situation had made necessary. The first was with Colton the attorney, who was not surprised to hear about the family in the back cabins. "I knew they were there," he told Fenwick with an air of having chosen not to think about it too carefully, but who was considerably more concerned about the letter that Fenwick described. Colton had not known about the letter. He said so with an uncomfortable specificity that suggested this was not an entirely comfortable admission. "If what you're describing is accurate," Colton said, "and if Pruitt's boy actually witnessed it, then there's a complication here that I was not made aware of when I handled the sale." The nature of the complication was, as Clara had known it would be, not straightforward. The letter Nathaniel Hargrove had written was not, as Fenwick had correctly observed, a legal instrument of the kind that would override a properly recorded deed. But it was a document that, in the hands of a sufficiently motivated attorney, could be used to support a claim of what was then called an equitable interest, an argument that the family's long occupancy, their contribution to the property's value, and Hargrove's written acknowledgement of obligation together constituted a moral and potentially a legal claim that a court might choose to recognize. "Might," Colton said carefully. "Not would. Might." And then there was the other matter. The matter of the children's parentage. Colton had known Nathaniel Hargrove for 20 years. He said nothing about whether he had known what was in the letter. He said only that if any proceeding were brought to remove the family from the property, and if the nature of the children's connection to the Hargrove family became part of that proceeding's public record, the resulting attention in the county would be, he searched for the word, considerable. The second conversation Fenwick had was with Walter Pruitt, Jr. He found him at his farm, 2 miles south of the Hargrove land, and he asked him directly whether he had witnessed Nathaniel Hargrove's letter of October 1865. Pruitt, who was in his mid-50s and had the careful manner of a man who has spent his life in a small community where words have long memories, said yes. He had witnessed it. He had signed it. And he would stand by his signature if asked to do so in any setting, because Nathaniel Hargrove had been a man who understood, at the end of his life, that certain things required acknowledgement, and Walter Pruitt Jr. had agreed with that understanding enough to put his name to it. "And the Reverend Halcott?" Fenwick asked. "Still at the meeting house," Pruitt said. "He'll tell you the same." Fenwick went to see Reverend Halcott. Halcott was a man in his late 60s, small, precise, with the quiet certainty of someone whose sense of right and wrong had been tested and had held. He confirmed everything Pruitt had said. He had witnessed Nathaniel Hargrove's letter. He had done so because the letter was a moral act, and he believed in witnessing moral acts. And he said something else, something that Fenwick included in his letter to his Philadelphia lawyer with a care that suggested hit him with particular force. "That family," Halcott told Fenwick, "has been the conscience of that land for 30 years. The land knows them better than any deed does. I would be very thoughtful, Mr. Fenwick, about what it means to remove the conscience of something." Fenwick went back to the inn. He sat at his window and looked at the Leesburg street and thought about what a conscience cost and what it was worth. On the 4th day, he went back to the plantation. He arrived in the morning, as he had before. The smoke was rising from the 3rd cabin's chimney. The laundry was not on the line. It was a cold morning, overcast with the particular gray light that precedes rain. But the firewood was still neatly stacked, and the garden behind the south cabin showed, as he looked more carefully than he had on his first visit, signs of recent attention. Rows turned, seeds in. Clara came out of the 3rd cabin as he approached, as if she had been watching for him. She was carrying this time nothing at all. He said, "I have some terms I would like to discuss." She said, "Come in." He had never been inside the cabin before. He stepped through the door and found a space that was small, perhaps 16 feet by 12, but clean, ordered, and furnished with a spare functionality that reflected long habitation and careful management. A table, 3 chairs. A shelf with a small number of objects on it. A clay jar, a folded cloth, a book. He glanced at it and noted that it was the 1845 edition of an agricultural manual, its cover worn smooth with use. A fireplace with a good fire in it. A window with a piece of oiled paper in the frame, letting in light while keeping out the cold. He had expected, He did not examine this expectation clearly until later, when he was writing his letter. He had expected something that looked more like poverty, more like desperation. Instead, he was standing in a room that had the organized quality of a place where someone was getting on with things. He sat at the table. Clara sat across from him. She did not offer anything, and he did not ask. He said, "I have spoken with Colton, with Pruitt, with Halcott." "I expected you would," she said. "You knew they would say what they said." "I knew they were honest men," Clara said. "Yes." He opened his notebook. He read her the terms he had drafted, the tenancy arrangement, the yield-sharing percentages, the right of occupancy provisions for the children, the maintenance responsibilities allocated to Henry, the length of the agreement, and the conditions under which it could be renewed. He read them carefully, pausing occasionally to check her expression, which gave him very little. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The eastern channel of the South Field drainage." He looked up. "Your terms do not specify who bears the cost of its repair," she said. "Given that the repair is necessary for the South Field to produce at the yields we discussed, and given that the South Field's yields are the primary basis of the revenue sharing, the repair should be considered a capital investment by the owner, not a maintenance responsibility of the tenants." He looked at her. He had missed that. He had read the terms 3 times in his room at the inn, and he had missed that. He wrote a correction in the margin of his notebook. She said, "The period of the initial agreement." 5 years, he said. 7, she said, with renewal terms at the tenant's option for 2 additional 5-year periods. He looked at her again. He said, "You are negotiating." "Yes," she said, "I am." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He said, 6 years. Renewal at the tenant's option for 1 additional 5-year period, after which terms are renegotiated by mutual agreement. She considered this, and the right of occupancy for the children. "Unconditional," he said, "for the duration of their lives, independent of any other term of the agreement." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the fire. Then she looked back at him. 6 years, she said, with the renewal option as you described, and 1 additional provision, which is that the agreement be recorded in the Loudoun County Courthouse, not just signed and witnessed, recorded, so that it appears in the public land records alongside the deed. He had not thought of that. He should have thought of it. He was a man of deeds and records and official instruments. But he had not, perhaps because the nature of the situation had caused him to think in terms of private arrangements, of settlements that resolve things without public trace. She had thought of it. She had, he suspected, thought of it years before he arrived. He said, "Agreed." He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, just a moment, long enough for both of them to understand what that moment meant, and then she took it. The agreement between Thomas Fenwick and Clara, recorded in the Loudoun County Courthouse on May 3, 1868, is not a document that historians have generally found remarkable. It is a tenancy agreement of the kind that became increasingly common in the post-war South as formerly enslaved families negotiated arrangements with the owners of land they had worked under the general rubric of sharecropping and tenant farming that would come to define the agricultural economy of the region for the next half-century. But it is different from most such agreements in several ways that a careful reader will notice. First, it lists Clara not as a laborer or a worker, but as principal tenant and managing agent of the property's agricultural operations. This language is unusual. It ascribes to her not just the right to farm the land, but the authority to manage it, to make decisions about what is planted, when it is planted, and how the work is organized. The owner retains the right of final approval on major capital expenditures, but the day-to-day management of the agricultural operation is explicitly in Clara's hands. Second, it contains a rider, a separate page attached to the main agreement and signed by both parties and their witnesses, that addresses The right of permanent occupancy of the 4 rear cabins on the property has guaranteed to the below-named persons and their direct descendants for the duration of their natural lives. The names listed include Henry and Ada, listed as parents of the principal tenant, and 2 others, 2 names that appear in no Hargrove estate document, no census record, no Freedmen's Bureau file. Names that Clara had given them, names that existed until this document, only in the memory of the people who had chosen them. The document records them. It fixes them in the permanent public record of Loudoun County. It makes them legible, legally, officially, permanently, in a way that nothing before it had done. Third, and most unusually, the agreement includes a provision that has no clear equivalent in other tenancy agreements of the period. It specifies that, in the event of the sale or transfer of the subject property, the terms of this agreement shall be considered binding upon any subsequent owner, and the existence of this agreement shall be disclosed to any prospective purchaser as a condition of any valid transfer of title. Clara had made the agreement itself into a kind of deed, a deed that traveled with the land, that could not be sold away from the people it protected. Thomas Fenwick signed all of it. He returned to Philadelphia in early May of 1868 with a notebook full of plans and a considerably more complicated understanding of what he had purchased than he had arrived with. He would return to the plantation every year for the next 12 years, making the journey from Philadelphia in April and again in September, staying for 2 to 3 weeks each time, reviewing the accounts with Clara at the desk in the front room that had been Nathaniel Hargrove's. The accounts were, without exception, accurate. The South Field, once the Eastern Channel was repaired in the summer of 1868, Henry directing 2 hired men through the work with the authority of someone who designed the system in the first place, produced yields that matched and eventually exceeded Clara's projections from their first night's conversation. By 1872, the North Field was back in production. By 1874, the South Storage Barn had a fully repaired roof. By 1876, there was new fencing along the entire northern boundary. Fenwick's investment was being managed. Not just managed, it was being tended with the particular care of people who are not maintaining someone else's property but their own, because in every way that mattered to them, it was. Henry died in the spring of 1871 on a morning in late March when the first tobacco seedlings were already showing in the cold frames behind the south cabin. He had been declining through the previous winter, a weakness in the chest that Ada knew the sound of and that Clara watched with the face of a woman keeping herself very still in the presence of something she cannot hold back. He died in his cabin, in the bed he had slept in for 35 years, with his wife on one side of him and Clara on the other, and the sound of the creak audible through the cabin wall, as it had always been. Clara wrote to Thomas Fenwick in Philadelphia. The letter, which was brief and factual in tone, informed him of Henry's death and noted that the spring planting schedule would not be affected, as the tobacco seedlings were on track and the 2 hired men who assisted with the field work had been retained. At the end of the letter, in a passage that breaks from its practical tone for a single sentence, she wrote, "He knew every foot of this land. He made it what it is. I hope that is somewhere recorded." It was recorded, in 35 years of a man's knowledge, held in the bodies of his daughter and his grandchildren, and in the drainage channels along Goose Creek that worked the way they worked because of decisions he had made. It was recorded in the only ledger that really mattered, which was the land itself. Ada survived him by 4 years, dying in the late autumn of 1875. She had continued almost to the end to move between the cabins with her herbs and her knowledge, her hands steady even when her legs were not. Her presence in a sick room still something that the families of the county sought, though now they had to send a message and wait for her to feel up to the journey rather than simply asking and being met. When Ada died, Clara was 42 years old. She had been running the agricultural operations of the Hargrove Plantation. She still called it that, even though it was now Fenwick's land and had been for 7 years. With a precision that had continued to surprise Fenwick on each of his annual visits. He had come to trust her management completely, and to trust it in the particular way of a man who has tested something many times and found it consistently reliable, which is ultimately the deepest form of trust available to someone of his temperament. He was not, in the full sense of the phrase, her friend. The distance between them was real, not hostile, not unkind, but real. A distance created by everything that had happened on that land before either of them arrived at the desk in the front room and began accounting together. She did not pretend it was less than it was, and he had the sense over the years not to pretend otherwise either. But there was something between them that functioned as respect, the kind of respect that develops between two people who have negotiated honestly with each other and found the other party to be as good as their word. The children in the south cabin grew up. By 1875, they were in their early 20s, born in the early 1850s, which meant they had been children during the war years, teenagers during the chaotic period of Reconstruction's early promises, and young adults during the slow contraction of those promises that characterized the 1870s in Virginia. They had grown up knowing, in the way that children in complicated situations eventually come to know things, the nature of their own history. Not all of it at once. Clara had managed the revelation with the same deliberateness she applied to everything, measuring out what they could hold at each age. But by the time they were old enough to read the courthouse document that bore their names, they understood what they were reading and why it had been necessary to write it down. They had grown up on land that was simultaneously not theirs and more theirs than most people's. They had grown up in cabins that their grandmother Ada had kept and their grandfather Henry had maintained, on fields that their mother had negotiated the right to work, on a property that bore their names in the public record of the county. They had grown up watching Clara manage, season by season, the ongoing project of being exactly where they were supposed to be. The older of the two, a young man who went by the name Elliot, had a particular aptitude for the mechanical aspects of the property's operation, a skill that seemed to echo Henry's engineering intuition across a generation. He took over the maintenance of the drainage systems in the early 1870s and proved, as Henry had proved before him, to have a deeper understanding of the property's hydraulic arrangements than any outside assessment could have discovered. He knew, as Henry had known, where the water wanted to go and where it could be redirected. The younger, a young woman named Delia, had something of Ada's quality, a capacity for observation, for understanding people, for being present in a situation with enough stillness to see what was actually happening rather than what appeared to be happening. She was the one in the years when Fenwick came for his annual visits, who watched the conversations between her mother and the Philadelphia merchant with the attention of someone studying a text she would need to know later. Both of them stayed. They had the legal right to leave, had always had that right since the war, and they stayed. Not because they were trapped, and not because they had nowhere else to go, but because the land was theirs in the only way that mattered to them, which was the way of long knowledge and long work, and the particular kind of belonging that cannot be transferred by deed. Clara had made sure they had a choice. She had negotiated the choice into existence, into the public record. The choice to stay was real because there was an alternative, and they chose the land. In the summer of 1880, Thomas Fenwick made what would prove to be his last visit to the Hargrove Plantation. He was 53 years old and in good health, but his business in Philadelphia had expanded to the point where his absence for 3 weeks twice a year had become difficult to manage, and he had been considering, for the previous 2 seasons, how to formalize the management arrangement so that his annual visits were no longer necessary for the operation of the account. The obvious solution, the solution that the numbers suggested, was to transfer the management agreement from an annual personal review to a regular written accounting, with Clara sending quarterly reports to Philadelphia and Fenwick reviewing them remotely, as he did with several other properties in which he had interests in other states. He brought this proposal with him to Virginia in the summer of 1880. He and Clara reviewed the accounts at the desk in the front room, as they had done each year. The numbers were, as they had always been, accurate and clearly presented. The south field had had an exceptional season. The north field was steady. The drainage was functioning well. Elliot had repaired a section of the eastern channel that had developed a small blockage, and the repair had been done efficiently and at a cost below what a hired engineer would have charged. When they had finished with the accounts, Fenwick presented his proposal. Clara listened. She asked several precise questions about the terms of the reporting arrangement, about how disputes would be handled in his absence, and about the renewal provisions of the original agreement, which was now in its second 5-year extension period. She asked whether he intended to sell the property at any point in the foreseeable future, and whether, if he did, the terms of the 1868 courthouse agreement would be disclosed to any prospective buyer as specified in the agreement's transfer provision. He said yes to the last question without hesitation. The agreement was recorded. It was part of the title. It would travel with the land. She said, "Then I accept your proposal." He nodded. He began gathering his papers. Clara said, "Mr. Fenwick." He looked up. She was looking at him with an expression he had seen before, the expression he had noticed on the very first morning when she had come out of the cabin carrying a bucket and had watched him across 50 yards of mud and April air. Not surprise and not fear and not hostility. Something else. Something he had spent 12 years trying to find the right word for. She said, "When you came here in 1868, you had a deed, and we had 30 years. I thought it was going to be a contest about which mattered more." He said, And Clara said, "You were the first person who came here who was willing to have a conversation instead." He thought about that for a moment. He said, "I think you would have managed either way." "Perhaps," she said, "but this was better." He couldn't argue with that. He left the plantation the following morning in a hired wagon that took him back to Leesburg and the road north. He turned once as the wagon reached the point in the road where the property became visible from the right angle, the main house, the outbuildings, the 4 back cabins with their wisps of morning smoke, and looked at it for a moment. He did not come back after that. The quarterly reports came to Philadelphia on schedule. The numbers were always right. The Hargrove Plantation, which continued to be called that by everyone in the county, regardless of who held the deed, operated under the terms of the 1868 agreement and its subsequent renewals through the 1880s and into the 1890s. Clara managed it until 1887, when she was in her mid-50s, and the weight of 30 years of management work, on top of a lifetime of everything that had come before the management work, had settled into her joints and her lungs with the permanence of old accumulation. She did not stop working. She would not have known how to stop working. But she transferred the primary operational authority to Elliot, who had been effectively running the physical maintenance of the property for years, and to Delia, who had the accounting intelligence and the communication skills necessary to maintain the quarterly reporting relationship with Philadelphia. Thomas Fenwick died in 1889 at 62 years of age. His estate included the Hargrove property, which passed to his eldest son, a man named George Fenwick, who had been born in 1851 and who came to Virginia for the first time the following spring to survey what he had inherited. He arrived to find, behind the main house, the same 4 cabins that his father's letter of 1868 had described. He arrived to find Delia, now in her late 30s, waiting for him with the quarterly accounts and a copy of the 1868 courthouse agreement, and a manner that combined complete courtesy with the kind of settled, unshakable calm that is the characteristic of someone who has lived their entire life, knowing exactly where they stand. He read the agreement. He read the rider with the names. He asked his father's Philadelphia lawyer about the binding nature of the transfer provisions. The lawyer told him what Colton had told his father 21 years earlier, but with greater certainty, because the agreement had now been in place and operating successfully for 2 decades and had established a track record that made its practical binding force considerably clearer than it had been when it was new. George Fenwick was not his father. He did not have his father's particular combination of ledger intelligence and pragmatic fairness. He was, by the accounts that survive from those who dealt with him in the county, a man more conscious of what he was owed than of what he owed, more interested in what the land could give him than in what it had cost to put it in a position to give anything at all. He came several times over the following years, and each visit was, by Delia's later account in a letter to a cousin, an exercise in patience that our mother would have recognized and that she had trained us to endure. He never broke the agreement. The terms were too clearly recorded, the history too documented, the witnesses and their successors too numerous and too respected in the county. He never broke it, but he never stopped looking for the edge of it, the place where the language might give him something the original negotiators had not intended to give. He found no such place. Clara had been too careful. Henry's ghost, in some sense, had been too thorough. Clara died in the winter of 1893, at approximately 60 years of age. She died in the same cabin she had lived in since childhood, in the same room where she had banked the fire on the night she told Thomas Fenwick what she needed him to know. The creak was audible through the cabin wall. It had always been audible. Elliot and Delia were with her. The children they had raised, the third generation on that land, were in the next cabin, old enough to understand what was happening and young enough to still be astonished by it. There is no formal obituary for Clara. Newspapers of that era and that county did not typically record the deaths of black women, regardless of what those women had accomplished or what they had survived. What survives is the courthouse record. The agreement, still active, still protecting the right of occupancy of the names it listed, still traveling with the title of the land each time the land changed hands. And there is a letter that Delia wrote to a cousin in Washington in the spring of 1893, after the winter was over, in which she describes her mother's death briefly, and then writes something longer about who Clara had been. The letter runs to 6 pages. Most of it is the kind of accumulated grief record that people write in the months after a loss, cataloguing the specific details of a life because the alternative is to let those details fade. But near the end of the 6th page, there is a passage that has the quality of a verdict, a summary reached after long consideration. She knew from the time she was very young that the only safety available to us was the kind we built ourselves, with our own hands and our own knowledge and our own careful patience, because no one was going to build it for us, and any safety that came as a gift could be revoked as easily as it had been given. So she built. She built for 30 years before the chance came, and when it came, she was ready for it in a way that I do not think Mr. Fenwick fully understood until much later, if he ever understood it at all. She was not lucky. Luck had nothing to do with it. She knew what the land was worth, and she knew what we were worth, and she refused through all of it to let anyone else's accounting of that value replace her own. She knew what the land was worth, and she knew what we were worth. That is the sentence that survives. That is the sentence that, once you read it, is impossible to put down. The deed recorded in the Loudoun County Courthouse in March of 1868 transferred title of the Hargrove Plantation from the estate of Nathaniel Hargrove to Thomas Fenwick of Philadelphia. The deed recorded in that same courthouse in May of 1868 established the terms under which the family that had been on that land since 1836 would remain on it. It named them. It fixed their right to stay. It specified that any future buyer had to know they were there. The Hargrove Plantation changed hands 3 more times before the end of the 19th century. Each time the 1868 agreement traveled with it, as Clara had insisted it must. Each new owner arrived to find, behind the main house, in the 4 cabins that every estate inventory after 1867 listed as unoccupied or disused, a family, not a remnant, not a lingering presence, a family, working, building, raising children, keeping the fire, maintaining the drainage channels that Henry had designed and Elliot had repaired, and that would continue to make the South Field the most productive on the property for as long as anyone worked it. The land sold in 1868. But the family that had been on it since 1836 was still there in 1893, and in 1899, and into the new century. Because Clara had understood something about deeds and documents and the relationship between paper and land that Thomas Fenwick, for all his ledger intelligence, had not understood when he arrived with his deed and his Philadelphia confidence and his $800. A deed tells you who paid for something. It does not always tell you who it belongs to. And there is a difference that Clara knew in her bones, that she had built into the public record, that she had made impossible to erase, between the land that you have purchased and the land that you have known. The Hargrove plantation was sold. It was sold more than once. The family never left. And in the end that matters, the end that the courthouse records confirm, and the accounting books support and the drainage channels along Goose Creek verify with every season they continue to function. That is the more important fact. The courthouse records of Loudoun County, Virginia, contain the 1868 tenancy agreement described in this account. The names recorded in its rider appear in no other official document of the antebellum period. The drainage system along the southern boundary of the property, or what remains of it, follows a line that does not appear in any surveyor's record, but that matches with considerable precision the description in Nathaniel Hargrove's 1845 household ledger of a drainage conversation with a man named Henry. Whether this means what it appears to mean is a question the records leave open. They usually do.